The telegraph on the bridge rang 3 times, demanding half a head, but the tachometer needle dropped like a stone. It hit 0 and stayed there. The ship lost steerage way immediately. We were heavily laden, sitting deep in the water, and the strong current in the strait grabbed the hull. It began to twist us sideways. Through the skylights, I could hear the horn of another vessel blasting nearby. It was close. The bridge telephone started ringing with a long, violent bell that echoed off the steel plates, but the engine was already dead silent. 1 minute before the drift started, a terrible noise shattered the rhythm of the engine room. It was a sharp metallic snap, followed by a heavy grinding sound. It came from the lower platform. The main engine jacket water pressure gauge plummeted instantly. The needle hit the bottom stop. The high-temperature alarm started screaming. The main cooling pump shaft had sheared cleanly in 2. The impeller stopped turning, but the electric motor kept spinning uselessly. The water inside the massive diesel engine began to boil immediately. This happened in 1985 on a rusty 25,000-ton bulk carrier transiting the Malacca Strait. We were heading towards Singapore with a full cargo of iron ore. The strait is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. It is narrow, shallow in places, and crowded with super tankers. I was the second engineer at the time. I was 28 years old, fit and strong, but I had never seen a failure happen this fast. The engine room was hot, smelling of diesel fumes and old lagging. The temperature down there was constant, about 45 degrees Celsius. I was on the maneuver platform when the alarm screamed. The chief engineer was standing right next to me. He was a large man with a red face and grease under his fingernails. He reacted fast. He pointed to the lower deck and shouted, "Start the standby. Get the standby online now." I grabbed the handrail and slid down the steep steel ladder. The metal burned my palms. I landed hard on the bottom plates. My boots slipped slightly on a patch of oil, but I caught my balance. I ran toward the pumps located on the starboard side. The broken main pump was smoking slightly from the friction of the shear. Next to it sat the standby pump. It looked solid. It was painted green, just like the rest of the machinery. I reached for the suction valve. The wheel was cold and covered in a thin layer of dust. We had not used this pump in weeks. I used both hands to wrestle the valve open. It creaked, then gave way. I scrambled over the pipes to the starter panel mounted on the bulkhead. It was a gray steel box. I slammed my hand against the green start button. I expected the familiar hum of the motor. Instead, there was a deafening bang. A flash of blue light exploded from inside the starter box. It was brighter than a welding arc. Smoke instantly poured out of the vents in the panel door. The smell was acrid and sharp, the unmistakable scent of burning copper and melted plastic. The motor did not turn. The silence that followed was heavy. The standby pump had a short circuit. We had no main cooling pump, and now we had no backup. Before I tell you how we tried to save the ship, make sure you subscribe to hear more stories from the engine room. The phone on the control console was still ringing. The chief engineer picked it up. Even from the bottom plates, I could hear the captain yelling on the other end. The chief's face went pale. He hung up and looked over the rail at me. "The standby is dead?" he asked. His voice was flat. "Burned out, Chief," I yelled back. "Main breaker tripped. It's a total ground fault." "We are drifting," the chief said. "There is a tanker 2 miles astern and closing. We have 0 propulsion." He came down the ladder. He moved slowly now, like a man carrying a heavy weight. We stood in front of the 2 useless pumps. The heat from the main engine was still radiating outward. Without water circulating, the residual heat in the cast iron blocks was building up. If we didn't get water moving soon, the pistons would seize inside the liners. That would destroy the engine permanently. "Strip the standby," the chief ordered. "Maybe it's just the contactor. Maybe the motor is fine." I nodded. I ran to the workshop to get the tools. I grabbed a heavy socket set, a multimeter, and a screwdriver. The toolbox was heavy steel, and it clanked against my leg as I ran back. My boiler suit was already sticking to my back with sweat. I dropped to my knees on the deck plates. The vibration of the ship was gone. It felt wrong. A ship at sea should vibrate. Now the only movement was a slow, sickening roll as the ocean swell hit us broadside. I could feel the tools sliding across the floor plates. I opened the starter panel door. The smell of ozone was overpowering. It made me cough. The inside was black. The copper contacts had melted into a solid lump of slag. The wires were stripped of insulation. The starter is gone, I said. We have to bypass it, direct lines. Check the motor windings first, the chief said. He was wiping sweat from his eyes with a dirty rag. It seemed impossible that we could fix this in time. The heat was rising. The ship was drifting into the path of a supertanker, and our electrical system was fried. But you won't believe how we managed to move the water without electricity. It was a desperate move, something that isn't in any manual. I took the multimeter and checked the motor terminals. I touched the probes to the copper studs. The needle on the meter swung all the way over. 0 resistance to ground. The motor is earthed, Chief, I said quietly. It's burned out too. Moisture must have gotten in. The chief kicked the pump base with his steel-toed boot. The sound rang out like a bell. We had 2 pumps. Both were dead. We had no spares on board. To rebuild the motor would take 12 hours of rewinding. To fix the sheared shaft on the main pump would take a lathe and steel stock we didn't have. The engine room telegraph rang again, finished with engines. That is the signal usually given when you arrive in port. But here, in the middle of the Malacca Strait, it meant the captain had given up. He was letting us know that he considered the ship dead. I stood up. My knees cracked. The silence was terrifying. Usually an engine room is 100 decibels of noise. Now I could hear the water slapping against the hull on the other side of the steel plates. I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The chief looked at the thermometer on the main engine jacket water outlet. It was reading 88 degrees Celsius and rising. The safe limit was 85. Even stopped. The heat was soaking into the metal. The gaskets would blow soon. We need water, the chief whispered. Any water. The general service pump, I asked. It's on the other side of the engine room, he said. The piping doesn't connect. Different system, different pressure. We have hoses, I said. I didn't know why I said it. It was a stupid idea. Fire hoses? The chief looked at me. His eyes were wide. You want to cool a 10,000 horsepower engine with a canvas fire hose? It's better than nothing, I said. Suddenly the ship lurched violently. Tools slid across the deck. We both grabbed the handrails. The hull shuddered. A deep booming sound came through the water, vibrating through the double-bottom tanks beneath our feet. What was that? I asked. The phone rang. The chief snatched it. He listened for a second, then dropped the handset. It swung by its cord, banging against the console. We just scraped the bottom, the chief said. We are drifting into the shallows. The captain says we have maybe 20 minutes before we hit the reef hard. If we ground here with the hull stressed, we might break her back. He looked at me. Get the hoses. Get every hose you can find. We were drifting onto a reef. The engine was cooking itself to death, and our only plan was a pile of canvas fire hoses and a prayer. I ran to the emergency locker on the upper deck level. My boots hammered against the steel grating. The air up there was hotter. Gathering under the funnel casing, I spun the dogs on the locker door and threw it open. Inside were 4 rolls of red canvas fire hoses. They smelled of dry rot and stale rubber. I grabbed 2 rolls. They were heavy, about 15 kilos each. I threw one over my shoulder and tucked the other under my arm. I ran back to the ladder. The rolls bounced against my ribs, bruising me with every step. I almost fell on the middle platform, but I caught the rail with my free hand. The friction burned my palm, but I didn't stop. The general service pump, the GS pump, was on the port side forward. The main engine cooling inlet was on the starboard side aft. I had to run 60 feet of hose across the engine room. I dropped the rolls on the deck plates. The brass couplings hit the steel with a loud clack. I kicked the first roll to unspool it. It hissed across the oily floor plates. I dragged the heavy nozzle end toward the engine. The canvas snagged on a valve wheel. I yanked it free, cursing. The fabric tore slightly on the outer layer, but the inner rubber held. I was breathing hard, sucking in the hot, oily air. The chief was already at the main engine cooling pipe. He had a pipe wrench, a big 36-inch Stilson clamped onto a drain plug. He was heaving on it with both hands. His face was purple with effort. "It's rusted solid," he shouted. I dropped the hose and grabbed the handle of the wrench next to him. We pulled together. 1, 2, heave! The rust bond shattered with a sharp crack. The plug spun loose. Hot steam hissed out, scalding our knuckles. We didn't care. Now we had a hole in the pipe, but we had to connect a 2.5-inch fire hose coupling to a 1-inch threaded hole. "The adapter," I yelled. "Where's the shore connection?" "In the store," the chief pointed. I ran to the workshop store. It was a small cage filled with bins of nuts, bolts, and brass fittings. I dug through the scrap brass bin. My hands were shaking. I tossed aside old valves and bent pipes. The smell of old copper and dust filled my nose. I found it at the bottom, a screw-to-flange adapter we used for taking fresh water from shore. It was dirty and the threads were damaged, but it might fit. I grabbed a sheet of rubber packing material and a pair of scissors to cut a gasket. I put the rubber sheet on the workbench. I tried to cut a circle, but the ship lurched again. The scissors slipped and gouged a line across the rubber. I swore. I took a deep breath. I needed a seal. If this leaked, water would spray onto the main generator switchboard, which was only 3 meters away. I cut the circle again, slower this time. The rubber was thick and tough. My thumbs started to cramp. I punched 4 holes for the bolts using a ball-peen hammer and a hollow punch. Whack, whack, whack. The sound was sharp and lonely in the silent engine room. I ran back to the engine. The chief had cleaned the threads on the pipe. We screwed the adapter in. It went in 3 turns and stopped, cross-threaded. "Force it," the chief said. "Just force it." I put the wrench on the brass adapter. Brass is soft. If I pulled too hard, it would shear off. I applied steady pressure. The metal squealed. It felt mushy. The threads were stripping, but they were also sealing. I gave it one last turn. It held. We bolted the fire hose flange to the adapter. I tightened the 4 bolts until the rubber gasket bulged out the sides like a squeezed donut. We now had a hose running from the GS pump to the main engine, but the GS pump is designed for firefighting and ballast. It delivers water at 8 bar pressure. The main engine cooling jacket is designed for only 2.5 bar. If we put 8 bar of pressure into the engine block, we could blow out the O-ring seals on the cylinder liners. If those seals failed, water would pour into the crankcase, mix with the lube oil, and destroy the main bearings in seconds. It was a terrible choice. Would you risk blowing the engine seals to save the ship from grounding? Or would you wait and hope a tugboat appeared in the middle of the ocean? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. We didn't wait. We couldn't. The ship was rolling heavily now, the motion sickening and slow. We were in the shallows. "Open the valves," the chief ordered. I ran back to the port side. I opened the suction valve on the GS pump. The seawater was warm, 30 degrees Celsius, but cooler than the engine. I stood by the starter. This pump was on a different electrical bus, so it still had power. I pressed the button. The pump roared to life. The electric motor whined. I watched the pressure gauge kick up. 2 bar, 4 bar, 6 bar. I looked across the engine room. The flat canvas fire hose on the deck suddenly snapped straight. It inflated instantly, becoming a hard red snake. It jumped off the deck plates with the pressure. "It's holding!" the chief yelled. I ran over to check the engine temperature. The thermometer was at 92 degrees. I watched it. 92, 92, then 91. "It's dropping," I shouted. "We have flow." The water was forcing its way through the narrow adapter, circulating through the hot engine block and exiting overboard. The heat was transferring. We looked at each other and grinned. The relief was physical. My shoulders dropped. We had done it. Then a sound like a shotgun blast cut through the air. Pow! A split second later, the fire hose whipped violently into the air. It had burst continuously along a 2-meter seam. A high-pressure jet of salt water exploded outward. The stream hit the hot exhaust manifold of the main engine. Huss! Instant white steam filled the space. It blinded me. The water didn't stop. The hose was thrashing around like a wounded animal, spraying water everywhere, on the hot metal, on the electrical motors, on us. The water was hot now, having sat in the warm pipe. It soaked my boiler suit instantly. "Shut it down!" the chief screamed. "Shut it down!" I shielded my eyes from the steam and ran back to the GS pump. I slipped on the wet deck. My hip hit a valve handle hard, sending a shock of pain down my leg. I scrambled up and slammed the stop button. The pump whined down. The water stopped spraying. The steam began to clear. We stood there dripping wet. The hose was shredded. The connection at the adapter had held, but the old rotten canvas of the hose couldn't take the 8-bar pressure. It was useless. The silence returned, but now it was worse. The engine room was full of steam and the smell of wet, hot iron. I looked at the thermometer. It had climbed back to 93 degrees. Then the lights flickered. Salt water had sprayed onto the lighting distribution panel. The main overhead fluorescents buzzed and died. The engine room plunged into darkness. Only the weak yellow glow of the emergency lights clicked on. We were in the dark. The engine was cooking. The pumps were dead. The hoses were destroyed. And under my feet I felt a new vibration, a grinding, shuddering rumble. We weren't just scraping the bottom anymore. We were dragging the keel through the sand. The emergency lights cast long, shifting shadows across the engine room. It looked like a dungeon. The only sound was the terrifying grind of the ship's hull dragging over the seabed. We were losing time. The chief engineer shone his flashlight beam around the chaotic deck. It landed on the freshwater service line running along the bulkhead. It was a 2-inch galvanized steel pipe. It was solid, rigid, and strong. "Forget the hoses," the chief roared. "Now we use steel. Cut that pipe down. Now." I didn't argue. I scrambled to the shadow board and grabbed the hacksaw. It was an old frame with a dull blade. I also grabbed a pair of heavy linesman pliers and a coil of seizing wire. Thick, annealed steel wire we used for locking nuts. I ran to the bulkhead. The pipe was mounted high just above my head. I had to stand on a valve wheel to reach it. I placed the saw blade against the steel pipe. My boots were slippery with the oil and water mixture on the deck. I took a breath and started to saw. Scritch, scratch. Scritch, scratch. The sound was pathetic against the groaning of the ship. The pipe was Schedule 40 steel, thick and tough. The galvanized coating was slippery. The saw blade skated sideways, screeching against the metal. I pressed down harder. My shoulder muscles burned instantly. Sweat ran into my eyes, stinging like acid. I blinked it away and kept sawing. I had to cut through 2 sections to get a 3-meter length. "Faster!" the chief yelled. He was already working on the GS pump, stripping the remains of the rubber hose off the flange. I sawed frantically. The friction heated the pipe. The smell of hot zinc oxide filled my nose. It tasted metallic in the back of my throat. My arm went numb, but I forced the rhythm. Push, pull, push, pull. Suddenly the blade snagged and snapped with a loud ping. I cursed. I threw the broken frame to the deck. I grabbed the pipe with both hands and started to bend it back and forth. The cut was deep enough. I heaved down on it. The steel groaned. I pushed up. I heaved down again. Snap. The jagged metal gave way. I had the pipe. It was heavy, rough, and sharp at the ends. I jumped down, landing heavily in the puddle of water. I ran the steel pipe between the GS pump discharge and the main engine inlet adapter. It was rigid. It wouldn't bend like the hose. We had to line it up perfectly. The ends of the pipe didn't match the flanges. We couldn't thread it. We had to make a soft patch connection, a sleeve. We grabbed the heavy rubber sheet we used for the gasket earlier. I cut 2 wide strips. We wrapped the rubber around the gap between the steel pipe and the brass adapter. It was a clumsy, thick bandage. "Wire it," the chief said. "Lash it until it bleeds." We didn't have hose clips big enough for this thick bundle. We had to use the seizing wire. This is where the real work happened. I took the coil of wire. It was greasy and stiff. I wrapped a loop around the rubber sleeve. I took the pliers, heavy steel grips with checkered jaws, and grabbed the 2 ends of the wire. I pulled tight. I twisted the pliers. Creak, creak. The wire bit into the rubber. I twisted harder. The wire cut into the outer layer of the rubber, squeezing it tight against the pipe. My hand cramped. The handles of the pliers dug into my palm. I did it again. Another loop. Twist, pull, twist. We put 10 loops on each end. It looked ugly. It looked like a messy ball of steel wool and black rubber, but it was tight. The vibration of the dragging hull was shaking the deck plates under my knees, but I focused only on the wire. "Ready?" the chief asked. He was holding the flashlight. His hand was shaking. "Ready," I said. I stood up. My back clicked. I was covered in rust dust, oil, and salt water. We walked to the GS pump. The darkness made everything feel closer, more claustrophobic. The chief reached for the start button. "If this blows," he said, "we are on the rocks." He pressed the button. The pump kicked in. The motor hummed in the dark. We heard the water rushing into the steel pipe. Whoosh, clank. The pipe jumped. I shone my flashlight on the rubber patches. The pressure hit them. The rubber bulged. It swelled up like a balloon. Psst! A fine jet of water sprayed out from the wire wrapping on the engine side. It hissed sharply. "It's leaking," I yelled. "Tighten it," the chief screamed. "Don't stop the pump." I dove back in with the pliers. The water was spraying right into my face. It was warm and salty. I couldn't see well. I felt for the wire loop that was loose. I clamped the pliers onto it. I twisted. I felt the wire stretching. If I twisted too much, the wire would snap. If I didn't twist enough, the hose would blow off. I gave it 1/4 turn. The steel wire groaned. The hiss stopped. The spray vanished. The patch held. "Temperature?" the chief barked. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked at the thermometer. It was barely visible in the gloom. The needle was moving. 90, 88, 85, I shouted. "We have cooling. It's dropping fast. Get to the control stand." We ran to the maneuver platform. The chief grabbed the telegraph. He rang full astern. He wanted to pull us off the bank. He grabbed the start lever. He pushed it forward. The starting air hissed into the cylinders. Chuff, chuff, chuff. The engine turned over. It groaned. It was tight from the heat, but the water was flowing. Then, boom! The fuel ignited. The massive diesel engine roared to life. The floor plates began to vibrate with the power of the engine. This was the good vibration. The rhythmic thrum of 10,000 horsepower. The chief watched the tachometer. 40 RPM, 50 RPM, the ship shuddered. Violently, a terrible scraping sound echoed through the hull, screeching metal against rock. It sounded like the ship was being torn open. We held our breath. The noise lasted for 10 seconds. Then suddenly it stopped. The vibration smoothed out. The rolling changed. We were floating free. We were off the bank. We kept the engine running like that for 4 hours. The walking stick pipe held. The wire rusty knots held. We monitored it constantly. Every 30 minutes I had to nip up the wire with the pliers as the rubber compressed and softened from the heat. My hands were raw, blisters forming on my palms from the pliers' handles. The temperature stayed at a steady 82 degrees. The general service pump pushed the water through our scavenged pipe, bypassing the broken system entirely. When we finally anchored in Singapore anchorage, the silence that fell over the engine room was the best sound I ever heard. We checked the damage the next day. The main cooling pump shaft had sheared due to metal fatigue. a hidden crack that had been growing for years. The standby pump had failed because a heater element broke months ago, allowing condensation to build up inside the motor windings. When I hit the button, the water shorted it out. It was a chain of small failures. A cracked shaft, a broken heater, a rusted valve. They all lined up to almost sink us. That night taught me a lesson I never forgot. In the engine room, you are never just a mechanic. Sometimes you are a plumber, a welder, or a brute with a hacksaw. You use what you have. If you wait for the perfect part, you die. I still have a scar on my palm where the pliers pinched me that night. It reminds me of the Malacca Strait. Have you ever had to jury rig a repair with wire and scraps to get home? Or have you been on a ship that went dead in the water? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every one of them.